somewhere that's safe where they wouldn't be sick. So you want to relieve suffering until the government or someone else or the non-governmental agency can step in, right? Sometimes this could happen outside of a natural disaster like a hurricane or a weather event. It could be a war. Got a lot of that going on all over the world at different points in time. So in those cases, people can come in and help in the short term.
Okay, Joe.
Yes?
Trying to sign it.
Okay.
It's a add-on to the housing.
I apologize.
No worries.
No, this is what I want here. It's working. Thank you, Brad. You're amazing.
Oh, I do my best. I will be upstairs. I'm going to tune in, so if you need anything, just call
Okay, great. Thanks. All right, so I told you I'd show you a picture of Fernando. We already talked about him. Isn't he a cutie pie?
And again, that is not my child.
Yeah. Fernando's been around, what, 6 years?
Yeah.
Probably, since the sessions have started, the Global Health course. Okay, so we talked about his situation and what's going on. So right now, we're asking you, we talked a little bit about humanitarian aid. It's short term, provided by both government and NGOs. But as far as your government, what would you think they could do to help Fernando and his family right now? Do they have shelter? Okay. In the case of a famine, which is what's going to happen with Fernando, what would you do as a government to provide relief for this family of 4? Food?
The organization of donating food and water and the distribution.
And the distribution. I like that, right. Of course, you can always gather food, you can donate food, but how are you going to get it to the people who need it? And that's going to be a key point later on that we talk about, so keep that in mind. We discussed what is aid and differentiating aid. We went over this first group of the humanitarian aid. Now this is the development aid part. Okay. So this is going to be different in that it's long-term, it's more sophisticated, it's more structured, more formal. It's usually considered something that's going to take care of some maybe underlying root causes and not just the short-term fixes. And a lot of times these developing areas will need something that's going to help to sustain them in the future. So it's not just about providing something today, but what about in the future? And what about those people that live there being able to provide later for themselves, so that we don't always have to be there as a donor country or a donor organization. They can help themselves, and that's sort of the teach a man to fish. You don't give him the fish, you teach him how to fish so he can sustain himself. Usually this is much more impactful, but at the same time, it can be difficult in for a lot of different reasons. And also, we always want to know, how did we do? Did we do a good job? Is this working? It's a lot different to say, well, we fed 1,000 people, as opposed to we helped them, plant some farms and grow some crops, and how are we going to measure that? How are we going to see if we did a good job and if it was something productive?
And I would add that a lot of times we're differentiating these two types of aid, but many times they happen together. They happen concurrently, either by the same organization or different organizations. So you guys know Doctors Without Borders, MSF, they really started off doing humanitarian relief, but now they're actually staying in places long term because these conflicts are going on for so long that they're doing humanitarian aid and they're doing some long-term development assistance as well. But because this is long-term, you know, you may not do an intervention and see an outcome in a month. You know, these are things that can take years to really see it to fruition. So it can be a little bit more challenging to get organizations, countries to keep that effort sustained for as long as you really need to make a meaningful change in that community.
So in order to look at the types of aid and to delve into this a little bit further, there can be bilateral aid, and that's just what it says, between one donor country and one recipient country. Something like USAID, which is the U.S. Agency for International Development, that it would be that kind of an organization. Okay, it could also be multilateral. Something like the food bank, it can represent multiple countries. It can also be an institution that represents multiple countries. So something like the UN even could be considered a multilateral type of aid. There's tied aid that can be spent on donor goods and services. Any idea what that means? I think you can figure this one out. Tied aid. What would that look like? Monetary. Okay. So if I give you money, what am I going to get back? It's tied to something. There's some sort of a condition put on that so that it's not just free money. You're going to have to do something for me back. Just kind of very, layman's terms. When we had, you have an example here of China. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, where the local markets then in that recipient country are not being fostered. They're not growing when something like this happens.
Right. So I don't know, have any of you traveled to Sub-Saharan Africa? Okay. Did you see any Chinese labor companies operating within those regions?
They know a lot about Chinese.
Did you say Cuban?
And there's one Cuban doctor.
Yeah, doctors are Cuba's #1 export. But frequently you will see in some resource-limited settings, the kind of aid that China gives is, okay, we will build your road, but we won't employ any of your workers. We're going to bring our own workers, our own equipment, our own materials, and in that way, sometimes countries will use aid to stimulate their own economy. But you can see that even though that's a benefit potentially for China, it's not really a benefit for the host. For the recipient, they're not using local labor, they're not using local parts, they're not building the capacity of people to fix those things if and when they break. So that's one of the issues with the tied aid.
Yeah, thank you. And then there's project aid, and that would be something that is focused on a certain specific need, whether it's a school or maybe a well for the community, one particular case, something that they need, a project. Program aid is for a specific sector, maybe an education sector, so it also is very targeted. And then for technical assistance, that's where something like the doctors she mentioned, they would move into these developing countries to help out with the development. It could be either program aid or project aid related, and it could be anything from technical advice, training those people that are already there in place, construction. The thing that this one reminded me of is when our National Organization of Clinical Lab Sciences, they go into a lot of countries in Africa, and they do what you might call resource building, but they go into labs, and they don't put our people there in the labs to work. They help build up the labs as far as technology and instrumentation, but they train the people who already are there so that they can maintain it and sustain it once we leave. So it's almost like a helicopter type of thing where you go in and you sort of put everything in place, but you also don't leave them there. You come back and you check on them and make sure that everything's running smoothly. So there are outcome measures and all of that that you can use to see how successful that's been. So that would be technical assistance. And then finally, like in this image here, this food, it says food aid, where countries who have an urgent need for food, that is provided by the donor nation, especially if, maybe they have experienced a recent disaster. And it could just be cash money so that they can go and buy food. It could be actual food, or you give them something so that they can buy food locally. All right. This chart shows you the type of aid that's given and who is giving that aid. So it's not going to show. I don't know that I can point. So if you look on the left, these are the different areas and the kinds of aid that are given. And at the top, it's the kind of sector. So we talked about governmental and non-governmental. There are some multilateral organizations that are both earmarked, and to me that means the tide. And so it's saying it's for a specific purpose. You can't just spend it wherever you want to. I'm telling you where I want you to spend it. There can be public and private partnerships. And for me, the debt relief was the most outstanding because, of course, it's almost the majority of the
your pointer.
There, okay. So the navy is the public sector. So look at all of the amount of money that's spent. The vast majority is for debt relief. So that's money. Humanitarian, on the other hand, the public sector donates very little to that. It's more in the red, where it's the multilateral organizations and it's earmarked for certain purposes. So you can see that water and sanitation is fairly large piece of aid that's given by the public sector. Other, I guess, is not able to be identified, and that's probably a large problem a lot of times with getting the information that you really need to look at all of these. Is there anything else that you wanted to say about this chart?
No, I think it just kind of, you can see here that, there's a lot of public sector aid to particular things. So water, sanitation, and infrastructure, environment, debt relief. But that public-private partnerships, NGOs, and these multilateral institutions kind of make up this patchwork. And we're seeing more and more public-private partnerships. So almost every major oil company has a, what do they call it, like a corporate social responsibility wing of what they do. They will sometimes partner with governments to be able to do that. Coca-Cola does a really does this really well in different parts of the world as well. So they're kind of the newest player, and it's always a little bit, when we have a new player in the aid world, there's a microscope on them because they may have different motivations than governments. So,
and interesting, since we're health professionals, look at health.
Yeah.
So the NGOs and the civil society organizations make up almost as much as the public sector, and then your multilaterals are there towards the end. So anyway. So, question for you that we can all share together. Why might governments be interested in helping other nations? Is this all altruism?
I'll write it on the board.
Build alliances.
Build alliances. Okay, good. Very good. I like that one.
Mineral rights.
Mineral rights. Talked about that a lot in the developing session, right? The development because of resources. Oil, diamond, copper, people. What else? Alliances.
Military strategy.
Military. Yeah. What?
Show off. It's just to show off.
To show off? Okay.
Show off.
That's what I'm going to say.
I'm going to put military/strategic.
Anybody over here have something to add?
I have something
Can I?
to say, but it's a little bit of neocolonialism. Like sometimes these aids comes in the sense that they want to help you, but indirectly it is not actually help. They want to find a better means of trying to colonize you economically and in so many ways in order to tap your resources and then giving you the impression that you're being helped.
So hold on to that thought. But when we get to the debate about aid later, I think that comes into play is that aid is the new way to colonize that is acceptable.
Yeah, it's all touchy-feely. Yeah. Anything else?
Espionage.
Espionage.
Ooh, I really like the way this
I was reading about this one organization located in Iraq and started up by a bunch of Americans. They had heart surgeries for kids there. And when they were first trying to start out, they were trying to build a company in Turkey. Everyone thought they were with the CIA. Just because there were some Americans who said, yeah, we decided to come here to help you guys out, and no one trusted them. Everyone thought they were the CIA, and they had to move to Iraq because no one trusted them. So they had to kind of start anew and have a very well-defined, like, okay, we want to do heart surgeries, not just we want to help.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that we do espionage. I mean, how did we get Bin Laden, and how did we get the intel? It was through a fake vaccination campaign.
Yeah.
Any other motivations? Someone said altruism. I'll put it on here.
I think you've touched on just about all of it. We might think of some other ones as we move through the session this evening, definitely. Okay. So we're going to do a poll everywhere. If you pull out your cell phones and join my group.
Do you want to do one person per group do it so we know who the winner is?
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. That'd be fine. So
Okay.
just do it by the table, and then you can discuss it and then submit your answer. And we'll go over all of this information. If you don't exactly know, we'll find out.
How do we keep score?
What?
How do we keep score? Of this group.
They'd have to sign on and register and log in. So I think that's a little more messy. Yeah, I took that one
Okay,
out.
we are going to trust you to keep track of your own score.
Okay, so has everybody joined in? Yes? No? Almost? Which country gave the most aid by percent GNI in 2015? You've got Sweden, US, Canada, or Denmark.
What is GNI?
I don't know.
What is GNI?
Gross national
Gross? Okay, she said a gross national income.
Right, so it's a percent of the gross national income.
So we'll delve into what that really is made up of in a little bit. But what do you think? Who do you think gives the most?
How much time do you want to give them?
Just, they should be done.
Okay.
Have you guys answered? Somebody from your table answered, right? One person answered, please. You did it? Okay. Your group? Yes? You've answered? Okay. So nobody thinks the U.S. So sad, so sad. Sweden.
So, is that it? This group here and,
These three?
okay, these three groups.
Okay, are you going to keep trying? Or I could do it here, I guess. You got it? All right. Okay, you ready for the next one? Which country received the most amount of foreign aid from the United States? Both economic and military assistance in 2013.
Whatever everyone agrees on. Most of Israel, but
What? Oh my. That's very sad. Answered? Everybody? You just answered? Yes. Everybody's answered. All right. Oh, somebody thinks Israel. Don't change. It's Afghanistan. Right? What is wrong with you guys?
I thought that would have been a little judgy.
All right. Third one. There's no difference. True or false? There's no difference between the amount of aid promised and the actual amount that they receive. True or false?
Has everyone answered?
Okay. I guess we know who got this one. Everyone. So promises don't count. All right. What percent of the U.S. budget is spent on foreign aid?
Has every group responded?
No, 1 second.
Yes?
No.
No? Okay. All right. Let's check it.
So which was the losing group?
You?
Kind of wrong. Oh, no. Which one kind of wrong? You guys.
Okay. That's all with the exam questions tonight. But now we're going to go over kind of what all that means. Okay?
So let's see. We have a two-way tie, and it is this group.
The first two groups.
And for the first time ever, we have a prize, and not just half a granola bar in my bag. Yeah.
My bag. It is
I will just be a candy fairy.
I was just like, I like Denmark.
Okay. So one of the questions dealt with that percent GNI, and this is a really interesting chart because you can see all of the countries at the bottom, and on the left you have the percent of GNI. This is in 2013, and if you take a look at that top line, that's the UN target at 0.7. It's not even 1. It's 0.7. And then the average country effort of all of these countries is 0.4. Okay. So we've got over here Norway and Sweden, and this was in 2013. And then, where's US?
It's right over here.
1.9. So, we all know what GDP is? Gross. Right, okay. So, this is the Official Development Assistance, the ODA, that's what that stands for. And I don't know all these acronyms either, so don't feel bad. I'm sure Dr. Patel does. But GNI. So after we look at GDP, that's everything that we produce within our country's borders. It's what we make, what we sell, what we have. What about GNP? Is the things that are produced by a country's citizens. And so if all of the enterprises in your country were owned by its citizens, so all of us in here, we're making something, we all own that, and we didn't own anything anywhere else, it's just all within our borders, then we would have GDP and GNI the same, right? So the gross national income would be the same as our gross domestic product, right? Do you think that really happens? No. No, we have people doing stuff all over the place, right? So, foreign ownership, especially in our country, makes these very different numbers. And wherever these firms are located, if I'm an American, I have something in China or I have something in Madagascar, that is part of that number. So the GNI equals the GDP. I'm going to read this because I can't say it. I'm going to say it correctly. The GNI equals the GDP plus any income receipts from the rest of the world. So my company over in Madagascar is included in that, minus any income payments to the rest of the world. So you have to take off something too. So it's kind of an odd equation. Okay. When you adjust for the percent GNI, you see that these countries here, these European countries, they're giving a lot more than what we give. So it's not just about a flat number. It has to take all of these things into context. So a lot of you, I know I could hear you were talking about, oh, I think we give more. I think we give more. 1%. It's kind of shabby if you think about it, right? Many of the Americans in studies think we give 30%. If you just were to ask somebody on the street, oh, we give 30% to foreign aid. The entire international affairs budget, that 1%, that's about the amount that we as Americans spend on maintaining our lawns. $30 billion every year. Or, that's how much we spend caring for our pets a year. Okay, that just kind of gives me chill bumps when I said that. It really does. So, that's what we give to other countries in aid. Okay. So this tells you a little bit about what we talked about, what is promised and what is actually delivered, what we have and what we're actually giving out. In 1970, this 0.7% was a target that was put out there, agreed upon at international aid and development conferences. So these people came together, they agreed on a number, and they said, this is what we feel like we should be doing. It was 15 members of the EU agreed that they would reach this target by 2015. And it has served as a reference for other members and other organizations and summits. This is basically the same slide. Is there anything different that you wanted to say about this one? It doesn't have the...
No, the only thing is
0.4.
that usually Norway and Sweden every year trade places as who's one and who's two. I don't know if that's a source of national pride, but it's usually those two that keep swapping in terms of the most percent GNI aid given.
And as part of these commitments that these organizations agreed upon, these 189 countries of the UN back in 2000 agreed that they were going to improve poverty levels, health of children, all of these things, disease, and that it would take, they estimated $195 billion a year. It would take combined efforts worldwide by many, many governments. And as you can see, not everyone is really on an equal playing field with that. All right, so with all of this aid that's being given, whether you think it's enough or it's not, how effective do you think it is? Is it effective? How do we measure that? How do we know? I mean, do we see pictures every day of the other parts of the world, even in our own backyard sometimes? I think even this latest disaster that we've undergone, I mean, it's brought to mind not just what's happened because of the storm, but even people who were in really a bad spot before the storm, and then after that, you know, it's really become extreme for them, and they don't have a lot of resources. Some of them have no resources. So we're going to talk about that a little bit later, about how we're going to measure the effectiveness of what we're doing. So who really benefits? This pie chart shows you. I keep wanting to use a pointer. If you would take a look at, this is again the average from a lot of years, so 42 years. If you take a look at the very bottom right, it says LMICs. Those are the low middle income countries. They are receiving the majority, according to these data, of the financial aid. So they are benefiting. Think about that, low to middle income. The low income countries over there on the right at 2%. The least developed countries, 25%. Down the bottom left, you have the upper middle income countries. Why are they receiving 14% of the aid? That's an interesting question. Why do you think that is? What? Natural disasters? Okay. So you're all with that altruism thing. They're needing help, you think?
Loyalty or alliances?
Alliances. Yeah. Yes?
Also, I'm kind of curious about this. Like, what metrics did they use to put countries into each category? Because I think that's a question worth asking. But then also, like, the percentage of population that resides in each one of these categories.
Yeah, how many people is that really going to?
Yeah.
I can tell you that for the upper middle income, which is that, where's the upper? Yeah, the purple one, the 14%. Countries like Argentina, Ecuador, Botswana, Chile, China, Cuba, Thailand. The low middle income, which is the majority, and the 31% would be Angola, Belize, Cameroon, El Salvador, India, Vietnam. And the LDCs, the least developed countries there, are Afghanistan, Chad, Ethiopia, Nepal, Somalia, like those countries.
And all of this, you know, the LMICs versus the LDCs, that's all just based on GDP. So that's how they're using to differentiate countries. And the reason why you see some upper middle income countries getting disproportionate amount is because they usually have pretty good governance, and they're seen as more stable, as less corrupt. So there are a lot of international donors that kind of prefer to give to those kinds of countries, even though the impact may not be as great. And then what do you guys think about the one unallocated by income? That includes Israel, which is not a low-income country. Why would we give aid to Israel? Not we, the United States. Right, politics,
yeah.
Regional stability, you know, it's of strategic interest. So there's definitely, and prior to the fall of this to the previous Egyptian regime, they were getting a considerable amount of aid for pro-U.S. Policies around the Middle East. So sometimes it's political, sometimes it's military.
Yeah, and so I wanted to read this quote by Paul Collier, who says, "The middle-income countries get aid because they are of much more commercial and political interest than the tiny markets and powerlessness of the bottom billion." So are you going to, I guess it's like, am I going to just throw my money down the drain? Or am I going to give it to someone, somewhere, where it can really make a difference? Which is a little lopsided. And they call this a pro-rich trend. I think it's been said. Okay. So in other words, this shows you that the people who are experience the most poverty are not getting the assistance that they need. Okay. I like this chart because if you look at these lines, and again, this is from 90 to 2013, so it's a lot of years, several decades in here. On the left are billions of US dollars, and on the right is that percent of the GNI. Start at the top, promised. We said, is there a difference between promised and actual? Well, look at the promised in purple, going all the way up to the 0.52 or 3 or 4%, right, of the GNI. Around 170 or 80 billion dollars at the beginning, and up to over 300 billion by 2013. Actual is this blue line right here. So just because we or a donor country says they're going to give this much money, that doesn't mean that that's going to happen. Look at the bottom green line. Poorest nations, those LDCs, they're getting nothing, virtually nothing. And then finally, the percent GNI is right there in that middle part. So outside of what was promised, what is actual, and who it's going to as far as the most deserving or needy people, you can see the percent GNI started out higher back in 1990, and it's actually lower in 2013. So we're getting less according to the percent GNI. All right, so this pie chart shows you the aid that's actually given and what is actually needed. This is in trillions of dollars. So the aid on the right is what's been given, $3.62 trillion, and on the left, there's a shortfall since 1970 of almost $5 trillion. So that amount plus more is needed. All right, the history of USA. Did you want to talk about this? You might be better at this than I am. I'm not a history major.
We touched upon this a little bit when we talked about development last month, but really the post-World War II and the end of colonialism in many places and rapid decolonization, there was this shift in the discourse from expanding empires to, okay, there are these newly formed countries. How do we help them kind of get out of poverty? How do we get infrastructure? How do we help them progress? So a lot of our current U.S. aid was really envisioned as post-World War II reconstruction of Europe. And this has been reiterated by almost every president since, and has been expanded to not only Europe, but to South America, Central South America, to parts of Africa, Southeast Asia. And really, this is one of my favorite quotes, and this is from President Truman. He said that the bold new program for making the benefits of scientific advances and industrial progress available for improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas is what he wanted to do. Now, almost any U.S. president you could imagine, President Obama saying this, or Clinton, or really anyone. But it was the idea that we need to level the playing field somehow. And that was a predominant conversation back then. And there's been a huge change in the culture and the ethos where this is pretty contested right now. It's probably the most contested it's been since World War II.
Yeah, and I like the idea about what President Kennedy said, that it was going to be the decade of development. So for him, it was a 10-year period, decade of development. But he was looking at taking these first two initiatives and really building them and developing them into something that was more sustainable outside of just aid and rebuilding, but something that the countries could continue on their own. All right. So, who gives aid? So this represents food aid. But what kind of is it called a balloon chart? I don't really know what this is called. Does anybody know what that's called? I think it's really cool how it looks. It's all bubbled out, so it doesn't really look like what we would think. So this is really the north. The larger sections are the north, what we would call the north. And then you can see the south is down here, and see how small they are. This shows the donors. So most of the donors are up here in the northern areas, as opposed to the southern. Yes?
Is this like percentage of GI or like total amount?
This is total amount.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, and this is food. Okay, this is not money. This is food, not of everything. This is just the food part. So most of those countries up in the top are in the northern hemisphere. Australia and New Zealand are also in there. So it's not really a strictly geographical divide, so don't look at it that way. And also, since things change and evolve, some of these countries are now, instead of being the recipients of aid, are now donating aid. So they can be moving into what's called this northern part. So it's called a north-south divide. And some of those who give aid, which formerly got aid, might be somebody like India or Brazil. So they have sort of changed from the south into the north. So it's sort of a more theoretical representation of that. All right, so who are these people out there in the aid world? Most of the developmental aid comes from government sources, about 80 to 85%. The remaining 15 to 20% comes from these NGOs, non-governmental organizations. It could be something like Oxfam, that is a development charity, and something like Dr. Patel was talking about. Even a lot of the corporations have entities within themselves that they foster to provide aid to other parts of the world. Coca-Cola is working in 56 of the 57 countries in Africa, and they are the largest private sector company on the continent. It aligns itself with USAID support to provide HIV/AIDS treatment and prevention and care for those employees and families of Coca-Cola in those areas. So they have programs for orphans and other children affected by AIDS and their caregivers, which is a huge deal in that part of the world. And they are able that way to earn wages without leaving where they live. So again, keep in mind Fernando. So if there's a famine and dad's a wage laborer, mom's cleaning houses, what are they going to do? Can they stay where they are? Or are they going to have to, make other arrangements? Okay. So in the case of the World Bank and the IMF, there's also the European Union, and a lot of these, like the Coca-Cola, these public-private partnerships work always in the context of aid. Okay, so that's just who's involved in that. So back to Fernando. We have some handouts to give you about famine, what has happened in Children. If I can say it's Children Texico, is that right?
You can say it however you
I
want.
can, because it's made up. I know it's made up. I think it should be more Spanish sounding, but it's not. Children Texico. So, okay.
nurses, so I didn't give 5 and 6. I gave the rest at 7.
Okay. So how do you usually present this? They work on that and then they present
Yeah.
their questions?
Yeah. So.
And then you
I'm gonna
talk
give
about
you
this
5 minutes.
family part?
Yeah.
Okay, after that.
So guys, we'll give you 5 minutes in the context of your group to read this and to respond to your question, and one person from the group will report back.
Yeah, I do. What I printed myself. I just printed, I guess, the whole thing. No, they're the
Oh,
questions.
no, they're different. Yeah,
pages.
the questions are different.
Okay. So they each got a separate page, one question each. Okay, gotcha. This is all just like so foreign to me.
I hate this.
It just scared me. It scared me. It's okay till I got this out. I was like, okay, I'm just gonna show up and just sorry. It'll be helpful as I progress. No. Because you always build on what you've done before as you become more comfortable and you learn more. And I mean, that's kind of lecture. This is just kindergarten for me with this. It's totally, I know what I believe and what I read about, but as far as a lot of these economic because I didn't I had to read it. I'll be fine next week. I just need a little bit of like oversight. The parts I feel weak in, and this is Emily. Yeah.
And this is not to say you have to do any of that.
Right.
I mean, ours are very different too. Just depending on how much time we have.
So we're doing really well, but
Yeah,
so
that's
resources do they have? And then
Oh, I also asked, because last year we had a site student here that kept all the like moving around, and this year they hadn't started coming, so I did reach out to them. We want that help. We want
I'm sure I could get most of my students. They would love to. Even one or two. They may not feel like they've got the time to do the whole course, but they would like to be exposed to it. I know they always say, I wish I could. I wish but I'm so busy with my courses.
the coursework is really, it's hard for them to do that.
I bet it's just scary, and I always try to tone it down. Like, really, it's not that. Really, it's going to be okay. Really, I'm not critical on the papers I ask them to write or I turn it in.
For this, it's totally doable. We had to, there was somebody that was applying to the program, which is very intensive, and because I also don't want us to risk
to err on the side of caution.
tell what was in the bag, like that works.
Anyone who had sort of had a death in the family?
It's just like go to somebody else who's not
Between Main Street. Yeah. But then you can visit people that are walking through Street. They're turning.
we have sandwiches in like they're massive. And in like the front yard, so then kids have to like go like Hanks.
So it was like an ordinance to sell whenever like those kids or something. They give me like running around with that.
When I started that's provided for it's kind of like a creative art, like the big landowner.
So, I was like, yeah, I know that one. Oh, you practiced there, you practiced. You like that. Yes. I know what you're talking about. She practiced, she's husband. Yeah. Yeah, I like how we all,
So like she was working on her computer. Wait, 6 hours ago.
I just know what you want.
Draws me.
Most of the time these days, I'm not like yeah, it's your part.
But. Right? I could sell these. Or I could eat them.
Yes. Okay, yeah. Sorry. I said 5 minutes, 11 minutes. Sorry.
So you want to go around and just have each of the groups? Do I need to summarize the
No,
they've read it? Okay. All right, everybody. Let's go around our groups and have one speaker from each group let us know about your question and what your plan is. Who has number one? Who are the victims of famine? Mexico.
Okay, so our victims were anybody who didn't have food, and that stemmed down from like if they didn't support the president, or if they're like they had a family member that had passed away and lost their job and all that.
So people have lost their jobs. Yeah. So why would they have lost their jobs?
It's like an agricultural based society and there's nothing to harvest, then there's that issue. And then there's like the trickle down effort from that, like there's no need for drivers, there's no need to transport goods.
It affects everyone, yeah. And I like the part where, where they say about if they had livestock, maybe they had to sell their livestock. They start selling all things that they need that used to produce them money, income, and now they no longer have that. So it's a vicious cycle. Anything else that y'all want to share? Do they have social support, do you think? In children?
Go ahead.
It's just like their community, like just at a very small scale. Just people that are around, they can share their troubles with facing, and that's kind of it's not really support in like a resource-based way, but maybe emotional.
So they still have their social support,
Yeah,
you think?
better.
Okay, so they do have that. So they don't have money, they don't have food, probably, maybe people are coming together from their church or other organizations and trying to help each other, possibly. Okay, I was going to ask something else, but I think we'll wait. I don't want to give anything away. Script reading number 2, the beneficiaries of famine. Who are the beneficiaries? Who are the winners and the losers?
We put obviously the people that have guaranteed access to the food sources, like includes the store owners that were mentioned are. And or we put like surrounding regions that have food sources that can be sold to them. Again, that kind of inflates shop owners' access to money too, or the people that could have access to the distribution of the food from the WFP. And put media, because media always has to have a story that people want to listen to, and they benefit from that. The longer they can run it, the more money they make. People who visibly donate are going to benefit from this. So if somebody wanted to give money like under the table and be quiet about it, that's one thing. But these are people that are openly saying that they're giving money, like celebrities, organizations, a country. And the president of this country is also benefiting because they're only giving extra food to their political supporters. And these corrupt politicians are gaining from that too. I already mentioned the surrounding regions. Oh, they're getting the surrounding regions are getting cheap labor because like Fernando's dad, he's leaving and I'm sure a lot of people are just desperate for jobs and they'll probably take any money they can get. Level price for years, I already mentioned that. Oh, and a really good one was anyone doing research or studies that these hotbeds are just people like coming in and that's totally taking advantage. It's not bringing anything to the situation, they're only taking information away. I think we talked about that last too. So there's a lot of people who benefit, and yeah, it's a shame.
Number 3, about the risk factors for famine. What do they look like?
So we said poverty and poor infrastructure. So like a high percentage of blue-collar jobs are ones that rely on demand, basically. So we're like this one they rely on the growing season, the harvest season for jobs. Our government is responsible for everything. And it's hard to differentiate that between that and necessary conditions. So question. But big thing was there was a big difference between upper and lower class. Lower class are very poor, and a small amount of upper class that are rich.
Right, so if you're in that elite status, or you're a minion of the president, you're somehow associated with this person, you're going to be okay. And everybody else down at the bottom who really needs that kind of need, they're going to be forgotten. No access, very little access. Okay. That group, are you number 4? Who's number 4? We're number 4. 4. Okay, good.
So our question was, you want to do something to help vary the degree of corruption, high rates of food conversion, and high rates of food conversion. What could you do as an individual, as part of an organization, and as a citizen of your nation? We kind of stumped with that because it's hard to if it's not going to be divvied up, or the resources aren't going to be divvied up proportionally as they should be, then just throwing money, throwing resources at the situation isn't necessarily going to help you do it in a strategic way. The only thing we really make maybe prepare either donate or as an organization partner with sort of more local organizations who know what the needs are and know how to get it done because they're on the ground, they know what's going on. Basically, you want to make sure you're not just throwing your money away at a government that's just going to give it to the high and the upper class who already has all the resources. So, you're still going to run into the issues of getting in there. I mean, you still have to go through the government, the president, all of those sorts of things. So it's not necessarily an easy route, but that would be something you should try.
I run into that same situation when I want to donate. If I go to these charitable organizations, looking for this, I don't know, that was too big. I don't know. They have all of this corporate heaviness at the top and then administrative costs. I try to do all my research. And at the end of the day, I want to do something local because I know about the Salvation Army here, or I know about the Women's Crisis Center here, or St. Vincent's Clinic, or any of those places, that I'm associated with. So yeah, it's not easy to know how do I just give this and walk away. You really can't. And even if you're there trying to, like you say, distribute it, we all know the stories. The truck comes in and it's loaded with food or supplies, water, whatever it is, and it never reaches the people. And like this little article was saying about, it goes into the markets at 10 times the value. I know somebody who was in, one of our coworkers was in Costa Rica on their anniversary when the hurricane hit there. And they had to move from their first level condo into the second level. And the manager of the units came to them and said, you owe me $500 today and $500 every day from here on because I can. And this couple, was friends with one of our coworkers, they couldn't get out of the country, they couldn't eat. They were looked down on by the local people because they were Americans and they were there on a vacation, so they were the elite, right? And they were standing in line for hours just like the native people were. Why should they be in line? They shouldn't even be here. They're just here on vacation. No food. They finally had people that shared one meal a day with them that were, good enough to do that much. They had access to a generator that then they ran out of propane. That was the only way they had to to recharge their cell phone. And the people, their children back in the United States were trying to get them home. So, it took weeks and weeks and weeks for them to be in this kind of an atmosphere where they were afraid for their safety in this environment, much less that this is what you have to face every day. And this is your home country and you're not going anywhere. There is nowhere to go. The country next to you is no better or they won't let you in. So it's a really, really tough situation to be in, especially with Fernando's family, you know. Because these poor parents, they had high hopes for him, and secondly for their daughter when she was born, and you know, and now this has struck them, and what are they going to do? And how are they going to receive any kind of help from the outside world? And your question lastly.
So we skipped numbers 5 and 6 and went straight to 7.
Okay.
We have our organization is in charge of making aid more effective and efficient. How do we go about doing this? So we thought for a long time, and one thing that came to mind was that we only have a percent of people in the most richest, in the most generous countries that are, I'm sorry, not a percent of people, we only have a percent of GNI from the richest countries going to each country. But we know that, countries can definitely contribute more. So a lot of that is just getting people to want to give more, getting them to realize, hey, we should be giving more. So the best way to do that is to get them fired up. And what gets people fired up more than political tensions? So we decided we are going to create 5 or 6 different false puppet NGOs that each help one specific political class or one specific religious class or cultural group within Children's Mexico. And then we'll kind of deviate the numbers a little bit to get people's pride into effect. So we'll have the groups that are opposing the current president, they'll get a little bit more money. And so it'll look like those people are giving more aid to their suffering brethren in Mexico. So the president then will have to give more aid. And so it's kind of a back and forth where everybody has to show off how generous they are.
Did you say the show off one?
Yeah.
Okay.
So how do you think your donors are going to feel about that approach?
Well, we'll try to hide it as much as possible.
Maybe we should have stipulated that it should be legal.
We'll have a very good ad campaign so that they don't even look at any of the stats. Right?
Okay, yeah, I need to amend these to include legal and ethical mechanisms. There's a lot of imagination in this room. So I did want to ask the question before we moved on, which is, we have droughts in the U.S., right? Parts of Texas have been in drought conditions for years. Why do we not have a famine?
Well, somebody was talking about the famine in India that happened during World War II, and the way they describe it is famines, are never, a starting catalyst for a famine is always a natural disaster or something like that, but what actually causes the famine is how the people in charge what happens after.
Good point. Because nobody really touched on the government. Yeah, we said the president, we know he's evil and the government is all corrupt and all this, and that's why people aren't getting what they need. There is probably food, there are donations and things, but it's not getting to the right people. What about the stability of that government? And a lot of times when we donate, remember we said political, so those countries that are very politically stable, that are more democratic and less corrupt, they're in a better position to provide access to these resources, whether they're donated or whether they're their own resources. So that's a huge component here. Now, how would you affect that change? Are we going to go in and assassinate someone and overturn the government, or we have?
We've already tried that.
Yeah, kind of, sort of.
Yeah. But I do think, to your point, that there are usually kind of risk factors that are already present in the community, that when something like this hits, it hits the most vulnerable. It's not necessarily hitting the elite. It's hitting the folks that are already vulnerable. And there are different strategies that organizations have used. One is to actually have cooked food, which isn't going to last very long. It needs to be distributed very quickly. So instead of just having truckloads of rice that can be cooked, they're actually bringing in huge amounts of cooked food that have a limited lifespan. There have been truces with, in the context of war, there have been truces with rebel groups to allow, folks in. But, aid diversion and the setting of corruption is definitely a big problem. But we'll get to some of the potential solutions.
Okay, are we ready to move to the next section? Okay. So that I think we just kind of opened up a lot more topics as we talk, but you definitely hit on some good points. And as medical professionals, we are concerned with health and health safety, diagnosis of disease, and treatment, right? So when we have something like famine, we would diagnose there's not enough food, and our treatment would be to give food. But we just talked about why that's not so easily accomplished. Do rich people die from famine? Probably not. And that's a little bit, maybe goes back to what Dr. Patel said about in the United States. Not that the people in a certain drought-ridden area are rich, but compared to a lot of other parts of the world, yes, we still have resources, even though there may be a drought. My home area in Central Texas has experienced a 12-year drought. People will tell you that, farmers, ranchers will tell you, well, we've been through a 12-year drought, and that cracked ground, at points, it looks like that. Did anyone go hungry? No, not at all. They went to HEB, and, and whether they had their, their card, through government assistance, or if they had a paycheck, because everything does not rely upon the agriculture business. They had jobs outside of that so that they could still move forward. So people who have entitlements, like the upper level, those entitled folks, they can always get what they need, and in this case, it would be food. There's a really good quote here that I'm not sure who is it. Who said this?
Amartya Sen.
Okay.
Nobel Prize-winning economist. He's all kinds of awesome.
So it said that starvation is the characteristic of some people not having enough food to eat. It is not the characteristic of there not being enough food to eat. That is so simple, so clean, and so true. Everyone thinks there's not enough food. I guarantee you, ask anybody on the street, what's going on in a certain country. Well, they don't have any food to eat. There's always food to eat. It's just they don't have access to it. I think we talked a lot about the jobs during a famine. We talked about people having to move around, like with Fernando's family. So a lot of times you have to sell what you have in order to buy food, and then even then you may not be able to afford it. So it goes into exploitation. As healthcare professionals, though, I wanted to ask this question. So do people die from a famine or in a famine? Yes, we just read that we had 700,000 folks in this town, this area that died because of the famine. What did they die from?
Malnutrition.
Malnutrition.
Already being sick.
Did they starve to death? I bet not. What happens when you're malnourished, like Lauren said? You become susceptible to infectious diseases. You can't fight off things that are just naturally occurring around you. Where if you're in a good state of health and you're healthy and have a robust immune system, you're going to be okay. And you're going to move forward. But especially children and of course elderly, those people are the least strong amongst us, and they're going to be the victims of this.
So if you really went into a famine condition and you wanted to help, you would also need to think about the medical component, because if folks are dying from infectious diseases and you're just giving them food, they're going to need more than that. So I think this is an illustration of how important it is to really step back and understand the entire dynamics at play before you kind of go in and intervene, because it can change the intervention. And also at some point, the development part is going to come in and say, why are some people more vulnerable than others, and what can we do to prevent that?
Yeah, and that brings in what we call public health. All right, so we have here some images, pictures, photographs of 3 folks. They're notable academicians, I can't say that word, anyway, smart people, that have come out as critics of aid. On the top right, you see Dambisa Moyo, who is a Zambian economist. She's trained in the UK and the United States, and she is an outspoken critic of aid. So we're going to look at sort of the both sides of that before we prepare for our debate. On the left, we have William Easterly. He's also an influential economist, and at the bottom there is Paul Collier. Okay, I'll just show you a YouTube video. Oh, sorry. I can move this away.
So while you're watching the video, what?
Hit the stage. Yeah.
You gotta get
Hit
it.
Now,
So while you're watching the video, I want you to think about what points kind of resonate with you, and what things you call BS on. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So the first video is going to be basically the case against, quote,
Zimbabwe's latest appalling chapter. It's a tragedy made even greater by the fact that this country once had one of Africa's better healthcare systems. No doubt many of you watching tonight would like to assist the people seen in our story, but what to do? Foreign aid. Africa is crucial to lift people out of poverty, but not Dambisa Moyo. In a controversial new book, she argues that foreign aid has been a disaster for Africa and must stop. Moyo was born and raised in Zambia, but educated at Oxford and Harvard. She's worked for both the World Bank and Goldman Sachs. The World Bank and Goldman Sachs. Her book is called Get Aid. In the West, it's been drummed into us that we have a moral responsibility to provide more aid to Africa. Now, in a new book, you start from the premise that not only is aid not a solution, it in fact is part of the problem. Explain that general thesis for me.
The problem is that it is malignant, and the book basically outlines many reasons why it is that aid has failed to deliver on its original promises. So let me just take you a little bit back in history as to what the origins of the aid model are. So the 1950s and 60s were a time when many African countries in particular, but emerging countries in general, were coming out of a colonial period. And at this time, there was literature in the economics space by people such as Chinnery and Strout in the 1966 paper, where they basically identified a very simple equation that savings would lead to investment, and investment would lead to growth. But the argument at that time was that in poor countries there was no savings, because these were newly formed countries that didn't have the requisite savings that could lead to investment and therefore lead to growth. So basically, policymakers at the time said instead of savings, we'll use aid, and the aid would
be investment for the savings.
Correct. And aid would lead to investment, and that would lead to growth. And the idea was that you would get not only growth, but you would have an alleviation of poverty, because with growth you could then move people out of poverty. But if you look back over the past 60 years, where Africa's received over $1 trillion of aid, the issue then becomes, on those two metrics, growth and poverty, have things improved? And the answer is a resounding no.
It's actually, you're pointing this out backwards.
Absolutely.
Per capita income is
That's exactly right.
So just explain that to me.
Sure.
That seems $1 trillion gone, essentially.
Basically,
and poverty more entrenched now than before.
Absolutely. And just to illustrate, in the 1970s, 10% of Africans lived on $1 a day. Now over 70% of Africans are living on $1 a day. So things have got fundamentally worse. And if you look at growth, again, Africa, to quote Paul Collier, who's my PhD supervisor, Africa is actually shearing off. So things are getting worse, and the rest of the world is moving in one direction. Africa is going in a completely different direction.
Basically, you're saying, look, what we should be doing in the Western world is giving African countries notice. 5 years and the aid tap is turned off. How would that work?
Well, first of all, with respect to the 5 years, it was an example in the book, and I think it's really important not to focus on that number of 5 years. I mean, obviously, we can't have a blanket prescription for all countries. They're very different levels of economic development. Zambia, my own country, is very different from Ghana, very different from Somalia, which is a failed state. So I think to focus on the 5 years per se is to miss the broader point that we do need a finite, transparent exit strategy. The programs, aid programs that have worked, the Green Revolution in India, or the interventions in South Korea, or the aid interventions to the Marshall Plan, have worked, I believe, because they were finite. They were short, sharp, and finite, as opposed to the open-ended commitments that we see in Africa, where governments start to view aid income as permanent income, and therefore do not need to seek alternative ways of financing economic development. And so how would it work? Well, I think we can actually start to think now about how we exit. What sort of things need to be done to actually encourage and foster the other things like trade and foreign direct investment, like the capital markets, to start thinking about how we replace the aid model. And there's a lot of scope for that. I mean, in many African countries, it can take up to 2 years to get a business license. This is not, to me, a suggestion that these are governments that want to see private sector develop.
Do you think that simply by putting these governments on notice, that would have a salutary effect in its own right?
I think it would be. I think if we start saying credibly, and in a way, the credit crisis has done that, with America facing 10% unemployment, with Germany facing 6% GDP contraction this year, countries are just not going to have money. I mean, as I said, the United States is already borrowing from China to sustain itself. It makes no sense for the United States to borrow from China to give Africa aid. There is going to be a contraction in capital, and the United States is going to need to focus on its own people. With 10% unemployment rates, people losing their jobs in the auto industry, people in the United States will demand of their presidency and their administration that they focus on domestic issues.
When we're talking about aid, what kind of aid we're talking about? This is not me giving $50 to UNICEF. You're talking mostly of agency to agency or government to government.
That's exactly right. That's a very important, it's an important point, because essentially there are 3 types of aid. The first type of aid is humanitarian aid, and I believe that's the sort of aid that would go towards a tsunami or an earthquake or flood. And I believe that there is a moral imperative as human beings and being part of the global community that we do act when those type of emergencies occur. So the book is not about that type of aid. The second type of aid is what you've just alluded to. It's the relatively small amounts of money that wealthy people might send to support a charity or an NGO, to support a girl going to school in Africa. And I think it's important for us, I myself, by the way, sit on a number of boards that do this type of charitable intervention, but let's understand what that type of intervention can and cannot do. It can send a girl to school, for example, but it will never make these economies grow at the requisite levels of growth, so we can meaningfully put a dent in poverty. And so it may be a good idea in the short term, but it's not going to help in the long term. And I very much view those type of interventions as band-aid solutions. And you're right, the third type of aid is really the big billion-dollar government packages. But I think the fundamental point, going back to your original question about why it is that we're in this situation, what the links are exactly, why it is that so much money has not been able to generate growth. It's simply because there are, of course, a whole list of reasons, but if you think about the worst case scenario, that the money is actually being used for corrupt purposes, which even today is still contributing to graft and rent seeking. My own former president, where I'm from Zambia, is embroiled in a scandal right now of stealing lots of money. Also, the former president of Malawi is also, as we speak, in the middle of a court case for stealing money. So this is still something that's very much part of the aid culture. But that's only one side. On the other extreme, the aid system allows African governments to abdicate their responsibilities of providing public goods.
And it distorts local economies.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a whole host of things. It kills entrepreneurship. If you think about...
No need for middle class.
Absolutely. And in fact, if you think about what I call the reverse Boston Tea Party, we're in a situation in Africa where we get no representation about taxation. So African governments are not representing the wants of the African people because they're not taxing us. They don't need to act on our behalf because somebody else is paying.
And I feel no obligation really to hold you accountable.
Correct.
You call this rent money.
It's in economics literature. These relatively easy payments, so easy cash is called rents, and so rent seeking is simply another way of talking about graft or corruption.
Now, you have a very interesting background. You made reference already. You were born in Zambia,
Yes.
went on to humble educational institutions like Harvard, Oxford, getting a PhD, then went to work for the World Bank and then Goldman Sachs.
Right.
When did you come to this conclusion? What was it that made you come saying, this isn't a solution, this is the problem. Aid is a real problem.
I think the artifacts of aid, things like corruption and bureaucracy and inflation and the fact that Africans are disenfranchised, is something that many Africans grow up with. And I think I only really started to realize that there was one economics model for developed countries and the most rapidly emerging countries like China, Russia, India, even South Africa and Brazil. And a completely different model for Africa. When I first came to the United States in North America to do my studies at Harvard and then subsequently to do my doctorate at Oxford. And it's quite disheartening to work in international organizations and to see relatively few Africans. And then you start to ask the question, where are the Africans? Why do we find people in international organizations from all around the world? And you very rarely see Africans in these places. And then you do realize that there's something fundamentally is going wrong. And I spent a lot of time researching this issue. My PhD thesis was looking at savings behavior and how countries actually achieve long-term growth. I feel very privileged to be born and to live in this period because we've also seen China move 300 million people out of poverty.
Mm-hmm. And you also make the point that Africa itself has become, in your words, addicted to aid. How did that occur? What does that mean?
That has occurred over time, and there are a few countries that voted with their feet or managed to escape the drug. South Africa, for example, and Botswana, both have not been dependent on aid to the degree that
they've turned
it down, and they've gone what I would consider the road less traveled. In other words, going to the capital markets. And we'll talk about some of these ideas.
Yes, for sure.
Unfortunately, it's really the addiction has grown over time to the point now that a number of African countries, for example, Rwanda, over 70% of the government's budget is aid dependent, it's aid sourced. And it's a great tragedy because with that comes the ossification of the civil service and the bureaucracy and the fact that there is really no incentive to seek better alternative ways of financing economic development.
And you obviously, like you touched on this, but I want to get into a little bit more depth. Also, this culture or addiction that's aid linked directly to a lot of the corruption.
If you guys want to view the full video, the slides will be available on Blackboard for you, and also for anybody that wants more information, Debbie Samoya wrote Dead Aid, which is like a really good book. So, what parts of what she said resonated with you guys?
The sort of like addiction cycle to aid and how that would, I didn't really think about the fact that like that would cause such like it basically like not necessarily a stabilization, but it would like stale out all of the bureaucracy of government and it would provide no incentive.
Anybody else?
Also, like during a humanitarian crisis, like it's still good to give aid, and because those are like immediate and emergent situations, and you shouldn't like bypass that.
So she's not talking about all forms of aid. She's really talking essentially about development aid, really.
Right. And I think it's important to point out, just like she did, that when we talk about Africa, that's the entire continent, and there are countries within Africa that are very different. She mentioned South Africa and Botswana who have turned down aid, and yet there were others that were very dependent on aid, and how they look, because of that. So just keep that in mind. Yes.
I like how she mentioned the Marshall Plan.
Yeah, she did.
And that it was very specific, short to the point. It was like, okay, there's lots of problems post-war. Fix these things, and then once that's done,
finite,
it's done.
And then out.
It's finite.
Yeah.
And pretty specific.
Yeah, cool.
Anybody else? What resonated with you guys? Okay, so let's flip it. Is there anything she said that you thought, I don't know if I really buy that? She's calling for a period of time after which there's no aid being given, no long-term development aid being given. So maybe that's not the only component that's driving corruption. Okay. What else?
She's pretty harsh.
She's actually not as harsh in this one as the one that we normally show. She's super harsh in that one.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what she has to say because you see also it a lot of times with like the volunteer tourism, like it just ends up like these local groups and local. And you guys talked about it a little bit last week. Like there was like all these different volunteer organizations that would go and like they would bring something, and then like when they actually were trying to build up the infrastructure in a country, like they couldn't get anybody to come and actually participate in it because they weren't being given something.
Right.
So like it does cost super commitments.
It's like I know you are not all as aged as I am, but you probably know someone or have come across someone, whether it's in your family circle or friends circle, where if they have been given a lot growing up or as young adults or into their adulthood, you might have an uncle or something or an aunt. And this is not always the case, but in general, I would say that the more a person is given and they don't have to earn themselves and work for, the more they're going to come to expect that, and the less that they will depend on themselves. They become very dependent. I think that's what she's getting at.
Like it's not like a trust fund baby. Like they're getting money and they're just wasting it on nothing. I know that's really like a really broad generalization.
But no, I get that.
So what was her solution? Her solution was cutting off aid. Did anybody catch her big kind of selling point? What was that? Finite timeline. And then capital markets. So bonds, raising money, and this, it's what a lot of countries do. Brazil's had tons of success with this, so has India. So those like huge emerging economies have been able to do well in the capital markets. But what's happening with those markets right now? Yeah, they're definitely, this is not the lowest they've been, but they're definitely on a downturn. So what she's saying is the free market will save us. The free market will work for us. What do you guys think about that?
Not always.
Not always? So when does it not work? Or who does it not work for?
The poor.
Right. So there's not really an incentive for governments to be able to reach out to them. And I do think that it has the potential to strengthen democracy when people are actually trying to hold to account their leaders. But in many of these countries, there is no tax base.
That's what she was saying, right?
Right.
Why do they care about us? We're not paying taxes.
Yeah. But
and why do we care about
But it's not that people aren't paying taxes because there aren't taxes. It's that there just isn't enough. There isn't enough wealth to pay taxes. So what she's saying could work in an economy where there's not as much inequality, where there is already some economic stability, but it may not work everywhere. Okay. So now we're going to hear Jeffrey Sachs's attempt at a rebuttal.
Is that like Sachs and Goldman stuff?
No. Sorry, I didn't. He's also an economist. He was actually one of her professors. I think they have a rivalry because of that.
Zimbabwe's latest appalling chapter. It's a tragedy made even greater by the Zimbabwe's like.
Okay, sorry, I gotta find this video.
So while she's doing that for just a second, I just want to mention that it's International Girls' Day. I know that? Yeah, International Girls' Day. So what that means in relation to global health, especially in terms of development in other parts of the world, that these girls who are being empowered to go to school, like she said, is a Band-Aid, but it also is crucial to the infrastructure or the progress that occurs with female empowerment, because a lot of these countries that doesn't exist, and so anytime we can celebrate and assist the females in these countries, I think is going to lead to better progress.
And Dambisa Moyo's point about being able to pay for a girl to go to school, all she's thinking about is it in terms of GDP income. She's not looking at the benefit that that's going to have on that individual, and that in development circles, if you want to decrease family size, if you want to educate children, you educate women. And there's all these trickle-down effects that happen. So this is going to be Jeffrey Sachs's rebuttal.
Welcome back. Well, if the wheels did fall off the world's financial system, then Jeffrey Sachs might say, well, at least the developed countries had wheels to begin with. The poorest nations have neither the system nor the wheels. But Sachs is no pessimist. He's used to fighting. For years, he's been demanding that the developed countries pool their resources to end world poverty within a decade. In recent years, Sachs has been involved in an often fierce battle of ideas with critics of foreign aid, especially fellow economist William Easterly and neoconservative think tanks, who insist most such help is wasted and often does more harm than good. This disagreement over aid is one of the central global debates of our time. In his latest book, Commonwealth, Sachs is again back on the attack. Citing past aid successes, he insists a true global effort to wipe out extreme poverty can work. And most of the development tools are already in place, just waiting for action. In New York, Jeffrey Sachs recently hosted a special State of the Planet conference at his Earth Institute at Columbia University. That's where we had this conversation. Jeffrey Sachs, welcome to Our World. Thank you for joining us. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you.
In your book, Commonwealth, you address head-on this strange welling up of a lot of criticism and cynicism about the effectiveness of international aid. You take it on from the very start. You suggest it's not only completely wrong in many areas, but very harmful.
Well, aid, we know, works when it's done well and directed to the right things. If you are practical about aid, specific bed nets for fighting malaria, medicines to keep people alive with AIDS, water holes to help people that have water stress, help for agriculture to grow more food. These practical things have been shown time and again to have fantastic results, and small amounts of money have huge effects. The naysayers just generalize. Of course, if we put money down the drain in Iraq, it's going to show up as wasted aid, but that was knowingly wasted from the start. How could anybody think that that was going to work? But if we fight malaria and measles and AIDS and hunger, there are such proven, known, specific, trackable, monitorable, auditable interventions that have been shown time and again to have huge results. You can't really argue with that. And then people say we wasted so much money. Do you know that we've now spent more on the Iraq war than all the world has ever given to all of Africa in all time in aid? In all of history. In fact, in 1 year, we spent more on the Pentagon, $700 billion, than the whole world's history of aid to Africa in the last half century. Not just U.S. aid, the whole world's aid to all of Africa. So we do very little. Often we do it badly, let's be clear, because if you hand over cash, that's not going to work. If you give it in a war zone for education, of all sorts, adult education, literacy, basic infrastructure. These things have been shown time and again to be enormously important for poor people, and not as handouts, but to help them get out of the poverty trap.
And we can prove that with actual statistics, decline of the infant mortality, for instance.
Well, take one simple example, so powerful. In Africa, where they say it can't be done, oh, so much corruption and so forth, UNICEF and the government of Norway and others teamed up to take on measles. Measles deaths are down by 91% since the year 2000. And not in one pilot project, not in, quote, well-governed countries, across sub-Saharan Africa. Millions of bed nets are being distributed when the International Red Cross and UNICEF have the funding to do it. They're limited not by their capacity to save lives, but by the funds that come to them. In Niger, one of the poorest.
Okay, I'm going to really have to cut him short because I don't want to go over. So, initial thoughts? Anything resonated with you guys?
I like what he said, that you can target your aid in very specific sectors instead of just giving a blanket
So,
plan for what you do with it.
right, so it needs to be very specific, it needs to be targeted, we need to measure it and make sure that what we think we're doing, we're actually doing.
Yeah, but what she was talking about was general development, the other one was agriculture scientific. So in general, yes, poverty is increasing in Africa, but there might be infectious disease that's slightly improved.
I kind of felt like they were saying the same thing, targeted goals or targeted aid to achieve goals like eliminating measles and improving agriculture. They're just coming from two different schools of thought.
And he goes on to mention other examples, and they're almost all health-related. So, I think that for this kind of group and for future healthcare professionals, the impact that you can make with interventions that actually prolong people's life, cure disease, manage disease, is probably the most impactful type of aid that there is.
Yeah. Okay, we can finish up with this quote by Marchessin. The challenge is to respond to the plight of the hopelessly impoverished without neglecting to insist that help come in useful and productive forms. It's basically, I think, what we've been talking about all evening. And I thank you for all of your comments and thoughtful sharing that you did. And this is the assignment for next time, because we'll be having next month human trafficking, especially human rights, and those kinds of things. It's going to be a very interesting session for you. So make sure you take a look at the literature and the news, and also reflect on the human rights and why that matters to you as a future healthcare professional.
Thank you so much, guys.
Right. Yeah. All right, that was fine. Yes. Okay. Thank you for your help.
Actually, speak on your desk.
I took last week, probably. Had so much fun. Thank you so much for your kind, supportive words. I know my weak points, and I can brush up. And it's always time, too. I didn't have as much time to look through everything as I wanted.
First session, because you've looked at all the things.
Yeah.
But the first one is a little, and it depends on the size of the group. If there's a week of tests, you might not have very many, and then the next week you'll have they'll all come.
No, that was good, and because I really wanted to hear, the reason I asked if you were Matt, I wanted to hear some of your comments, because I know you have had a lot of experiences that I can learn from, and then that way I can incorporate them in.
I think what's so interesting is that each group kind of has their separate personality.
What was he talking about? That's just crazy. I just couldn't believe that. It's funny. I think this is yours, if you want to keep it. This is like all my stuff
Okay,
that I printed
I'm not
out.
going to move your stuff.
This is my stuff. This is your stuff.
Oh, Brad, can we get, do we have a pointer
Yeah.
that we can use? I think that would have been helpful.
Yeah, because of all those
Yeah.
graphs and stuff.
We do. I have to ask Kaylee for it. She has it in
I
her
think maybe
office.
if next week we could have that.
And we'll have more candy for next week. We still have some left, right?
I'm going to have